I'm excited to share some of the findings that I've been working on as part of my dissertation. And today I'll be speaking to you about childhood linear growth velocity in the Terai of Nepal. So we all know that growth is an important marker of well-being, and there's a high degree of investment ongoing to improve the linear growth of children across the world. So what is linear growth, though, linear growth faltering as opposed to stunting? I'll walk you through some of this. Stunting, I think, is very familiar to all of you, known as a height for age Z-score under -2 when compared to some global standard or reference. And typically what we use in the global nutrition community is WHO child growth standards. But this reflects a growth that is already failed. And it's measured by these attained measures of indicators of growth. Growth faltering, however, reflects a more dynamic process of growth, and it is the process that is leading to stunted or failed growth. So linear growth faltering is a failure to reach one's growth potential, and linear growth retardation implies that children are too short for their age, but that does not imply that they are stunted yet. So in a population that is normally distributed, as you can see in the back, under -2 is where we typically define a child being stunted. But all the children below the 0 median line also are short for their age, even if they're not stunted. So this becomes particularly important in low and middle income settings, where the whole height for age Z distribution is already left shifted, and thus a majority of the population is experiencing some degree of growth faltering already. So when does growth faltering typically occur during childhood, and when are children most at risk? This is a graph that some of you might be familiar with from Victoria and colleagues describing the timing of growth faltering using cross-sectional data from the WHO global database, which is primarily a database of mix and DHS surveys. So the blue line, the height for age Z line here, is what is reflecting linear growth faltering, and shows us that growth faltering is really occurring within that first 2 years of life, after which there is little recovery that we see. But our understanding of what leads to stunting during those 24 months is oftentimes informed by cross-sectional data analyses, where we're mixing children that are stunted with those that are not, with factors that range this 0 to 59 months of age. So it's sort of mixing the effects here, and so some of the protective or risk factors may not be fully elucidated in those types of analyses. So the etiological relevance of those factors become questionable, and an advantage of longitudinal data is the ability to address issues of temporality when it comes to taking risk factors and their association with growth faltering that's occurring in the future, over a growth interval. So the motivation for this work is first to identify faltering in growth faltering amongst children in their preschool age, irrespective of their attained height for age. And also, given that studies primarily measure stunting, we want to use velocity measures to assess growth faltering. And currently, there are no velocity references that exist at annual increments throughout the preschool age period. Oftentimes, references are focused within that 0 to 2 years of age. And then why we want to do all of this is because there exists a need to measure the process of faltered growth and to understand faltering before a child is, stunted or experiences growth faltering. So the specific objectives that I'll run through, and I'll be focusing more on objective 1 in the interest of time. It's to estimate the patterns of growth faltering in preschool age children in the Terai of Nepal between 2013 and 16 using derived linear growth velocity references. And then objective 2 is to identify antecedent community, household, and individual risk factors that are associated with this growth faltering. All the study objectives were answered using data that came from the Poshan Community Studies, a study that started in 2012 and ran through till 2016. The parent study really sought to assess agricultural production practices, household food security, diet, and nutritional status of women and children, both annually and seasonally, and to identify pathways that could be used by public health programs, a variety of public health programs, to see how agriculture may improve nutritional outcomes downstream. So it's a longitudinal observational study. It was nationally representative and sampled to elucidate agroecological variation. So just very quickly, this is the broader study design, and my focus, as I mentioned, is in the Tarai. So after the country was stratified into mountains, hills, and the Tarai, we systematically randomly sampled 7 VDCs, and amongst those 7 VDCs, we randomly sampled 3 wards. And so in total, we had 21 wards that we were following over 4 years. And within those wards, we did a full census. So any household with a child under 5 was included in the study. If there were new children born each year when we returned, we would include them in the study. And the households and children were retained within the study up until they were 71 months of age, or if they moved out of the study area, they were no longer included. So this is just a pictorial depiction of our study design. And also, just to repeat, data collection occurred annually. So very quickly, I feel like I don't really have to run through too much into context here with this crowd, but the Tarai, just to recap, is holds 50% of at least of Nepal's population. It's a breadbasket of the country, but continues to endure very high rates of wasting and stunting amongst preschool-age children. It's primarily agrarian and natural disaster prone. So in terms of data collected annually, like I was talking about, we collected them on different levels, at the community level, household, and individual level. So community included anything from market access, community infrastructure, and then at the household level, everything from assets to sanitation to women's decision-making, household food security, and then at the individual level, women and children's dietary intake and nutritional status was measured, as well as the mother's education level, knowledge, infant and young child feeding practices, her education and occupation. So going back to the specific objectives of patterns of growth, examining patterns of growth faltering, to talk you through like how to think about this, again, as I mentioned, measuring growth velocity is a slope or rate of growth. So essentially how it's measured is a height velocity expressed as centimeters per year is calculated as the difference between height between 2 time points and then divided by the time in between those time points. To annualize it, I multiplied it by 365 days. So in total, for this aim, I calculated 8,347 growth intervals for 4,449 children. So we used these annualized velocities given the interval at which the data was collected, but there's an advantage of doing these annualized velocities as well, which is, as you know, early in life, there's very high variability in growth, and using these annualized velocities kind of helps decrease some of the variability that you will catch by these measuring velocity at short intervals, which have been shown to have very little correlation with each other when seen consecutively, and are more related to the process of saltatory growth versus revealing actual patterns of either accelerated or decelerated growth. So we needed an annualized reference with which to compare our population. So you have the growth, WHO growth standards, and that's typically what you use to get your height for age Z-score. So we needed something to calculate a Z-score as well for linear growth velocity. So in our review, we were unable to find globally representative annualized linear growth velocity standards for under 5 children throughout the span of the preschool age period. So as such, we combined 2 very commonly and widely used, accepted references and standards, the WHO growth standards from ages 0 to 12 months, and then the well-known Tanner velocity reference from British children for the ages of 13 to 59 months. So this combined and derived reference produced annualized estimates for growth velocity, as shown in this graph here. And I generated these using cubic restricted spline models, given the curved linear relationship between height and age. And these models actually fit really well together and produce smooth, continuous, fitted sex-specific median curves. So these are the median velocity references for boys in turquoise and purple for girls. And the justification for combining these references is that there's quite a bit of data that has shown that among children who are not experiencing any kind of issues with socioeconomic status or health access limitations, regardless of their geographic locations, there's little variation in the linear growth process, and that height for age distributions tend to be quite similar. So we're using this as a reference. So what happens when we plot the Tarai children against that reference, right? So that's all the gray dots are boys and girls on the left and right. And the solid line represents the median reference curve, linear growth velocity reference curve for boys, and then girls. And the dotted lines are the +2 and the -2 z-score lines. So really what this graph is trying to show you is that overall majority of the study population is growing below the velocity of the referent median, regardless of their age. And what we're proposing from here is a metric by which one can evaluate growth faltering at a population level using a linear growth velocity z-score, which can be applied to ascertaining faltering at a population level, and the z-score formula is shown here. It's very similar to how HAZ is, or a z-score for height for age is constructed, only that it's replaced with linear growth velocity using the reference shown above. So when we look at growth patterns amongst boys and girls in Nepal, using that the z-score computation, expressed as z-scores, departure from the median reference was marked for both sexes combined, with children exhibiting a mean linear growth velocity z that is negative in value. So the percentage of growth faltering that we see is approximately 26% of boys and 36% of girls experiencing growth faltering under 6 months of age, and that kind of stays consistent up until the 24-month age mark, after which we see a drop in the proportion experiencing growth faltering to about 5 to 6% for both sexes. Growth rates expressed as a mean linear growth velocity z-score were significantly worse for girls, less than 6 months at 6 to 11 months of age and 12 to 23 months of age. So what about those who are stunted at the outset of a growth interval, and what kind of growth faltering do they experience over that year period? So it appears that children less than 24 months of age who have, and this is, so I'm just looking at the first 2 years, who are not identified as stunted at the beginning of an age interval are experiencing growth faltering in the coming year, with about 30% of children experiencing that. But worryingly, even those that are identified as stunted are continuing to experience further growth faltering. So we see this at rates of 18%. I feel like I have the boxes on the wrong side. So just move over a column, but 18%, 27%, and 31%. So there's still growth faltering occurring amongst children who are already stunted, right? So for the second objective, again, running through quickly, in terms of identifying risk factors associated with faltered growth, linear growth, I'm going to not go through this, but essentially we use a conceptual framework adapted from the UNICEF framework for undernutrition. And this is just to say that growth is complicated, there's a lot of factors involved, and these were the factors that we measured to be able to include in the model to see what they were associated with, or which factors were associated with growth faltering. We used age-stratified analyses, and our final models included multivariate logistic regressions that were run with select risk factors and linear growth faltering. So just to recap this picture, risk factors were measured at time point 1, and we were looking at the association with faltering over that slope of that time period. Again, interest of time. So I'm just going to show you the ends of the spectrum. For children under 6 months, the kinds of risk factors we saw associated with growth faltering, and then children 36 to 48 months. So these are the different levels of the risk factors. So we have the immediate, underlying, and basic risk factors in this graph. And the green line in the middle, the dotted line, is the odds ratio of 1. So if you're on the left, the diamonds on the left, it's an odds ratio indicating decreased odds, and a diamond on the right with increased odds, and the black bars indicating the confidence interval. So at this age group, we saw significant risk factors associated with an increased odds of growth faltering to be having a height for age Z-score greater than WHO standard median, maternal short stature, increased maternal parity, and in terms of factors that decreased odds of faltering, it included a weight for height Z-score above the standard median, so they had an appropriate weight for height Z, maternal education, access to health facilities, and residence within a ward with roads. As we moved on to the other end of the spectrum in terms of age, we did see that risk factors decreased, and we saw increased odds of faltering within the 36 to 47 month group. The factors included a high for age Z above the WHO standard median, maternal dietary diversity greater than 5 groups, and maternal decisions on child health care, which seems contradictory, but if you see those are really terribly wide confidence intervals. So even if it's significant, we're not very confident about there's a higher degree of variability, and there's sparse data bias going on there as well. And in terms of decreased odds of faltering, we saw being closer to markets, residing in wards with paved roads and schools being protective. So overall, high proportion of children with low growth velocities in the first 2 years of life, regardless of age. There are gender differences, with girls being more at risk. And risk factors varied by age, as well as substantially decreased with age. And there seem to be factors proximate to the mother and child that are more important early in life, and that as the child grows up, the factors reflecting a child's environment and social positioning became of higher importance. There is also this consistent relationship between WHC above the median with being associated with decreased odds of faltering, and that really does point us towards the relationship between stunting and wasting that's often talked about, that needs to be further understood. So the plug is, maybe we can think about even assessment of programs in this way of, assessing linear growth velocity versus just a static measure of height for age Z. It also just urges to the work adds to an evidence base on factors that may affect child growth and can inform ongoing discussions. I've taken 3 minutes away from Andrew's time with his permission, so excuse him if his presentation isn't that great. But I wanted to, really wanted to acknowledge, this is like the only time I have, I think, to acknowledge all the wonderful people that were a part of this study. It was definitely not something we did alone. And these are our huge data collection teams, which consisted of data collectors from New Era and NTAG. And they were just, produced all this data. But I think it teaches us that we need to move to mobile data collection. But it was an immense amount of work, and I really appreciate the time the Poshan families dedicated, and the mothers and children. And there's a whole bunch of people here, from the Poshan study in Nepal to the New Era field data teams, to Nepali technical assistance groups, Tufts University, NIPS. All of their names are bolded for those of you who are here. And of course, the team at Hopkins in Baltimore. And we really acknowledge the kind support of USAID for this work over the years. And I also just wanted to acknowledge some committee members who had scientific input into some of my work. So thank you very, very much for your time.